All set, Dan? Okay, I will now call this meeting of the South Whidbey School Board to order. I will turn first to Director Joe Greenherron for the land acknowledgement.
Please give me 1 second to pull it up. Oh, I already,
Just checking for those watching on Zoom. Are you hearing me now? Yeah, you're welcome to steal Marnie's spot.
Marnie's not coming too,
right.
right? Okay.
That'll be the second thing.
okay, ready. South Whidbey School District would like to begin by acknowledging that we gather on the ancestral homelands, originally known as Chocolche in Luxseed, of the coastal Salish peoples, on the lands of the lower Skagit, Tulalip, Swinomish, Snohomish, Stillaguamish, and Squamish, who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin since time immemorial and have hunted, fished, gathered, and taken care of these lands. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and we honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude to the indigenous people of this territory and for their enduring care and protection of the land in which we currently occupy and share through the Treaty of Point Elliott, signed by 82 tribes in Mukilteo on January 22nd, 1855.
Thank you. I will note that Marnie has mentioned that she will not be able to attend and asked us to excuse her absence. Unless there's any issue with that, I think it's for personal reasons. And then I'll just note that if you would like to, we're going to be going through the budget today, and if you have anything to comment or ask or anything like that about anything that comes up on the budget, you're more than welcome to chime in. Mr. Pullman or one of us will respond gladly. Please, if you do have a comment or question and you're on the Zoom, use the Q&A feature and just put in your name and location so that we know that you have a question and we can wait for you. And then we'll get the comment from you and then move on so we aren't well past where we want to be or where you want to comment on. With that in mind, Mr. Pullman, it's all you.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk about the budget for the 22-23 school year, which begins September 1st and goes through August 31st. We operate on a fiscal year, unlike a calendar year. And the F-195 is what OSPI, the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, refers to a budget document. They give all their documents a letter and a number sequence. So when we talk about those, and F just stands for fiscal. So it's a working document. This isn't the final product. It won't be finalized until the board approves it 2 weeks from tonight. And please do ask questions as we go through this, and we'll try to answer them as they pop up as opposed to wait until later. All the documentation, this presentation, and the 3 formal documents that go with it are on the website. So if you go to South Whidbey School District, Departments, Business Services under budget, there's a 22-23 budget. There's 4 documents there, and it will cover it. 3 of them are the official OSPI documents, and they're quite large and dry. We'll cover that information tonight, but not as in much detail as the budget itself may show. It will show things like salaries by activity and program and FTE and things that are more condensed in this version. So in the F-195, there are legal requirements that we have to pertain to by RCW, the Revised Code of Washington. The first is that we have to give the community an opportunity for public input, and that is officially done at the hearing and adoption date, which is 2 weeks from tonight. It gives the opportunity for anybody that wishes to talk about any part of the budget for any reason, that particular opportunity on that night to make those comments before the board approves the budget. We also have to have a balanced budget. And what that means in this state is that the expenditures cannot exceed, it'd be a fund balance plus a revenue amount. and still maintain a fund balance as appropriate based upon policy or whatever. So we cannot have for multiple years exceeding expenditure over revenue. And we can do it while we have fund balance, but that only happens for a while. The other thing is we do a school board policy about fund balance is that I have to budget a 6% fund balance each year. Different than a fund balance policy says we have to have a 6% fund balance. It's just that every year in the budget process, I have to create that. So we'll see as we go through that. And then there's finally the adoption. And like I said, it's 2 weeks from tonight. The board will hear public comment if there is any, and then it will, by resolution, adopt the budget, the 4-year budget plan and everything that's involved in there. I have to have that to the ESD by the 1st of August because we are a second-class district. So we are a shorter time frame than the larger districts. And then it goes from them after they review it off to OSBI for the final review. We also have to pertain to the accounting manuals for public schools in the state of Washington, which is created by the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction in collaboration with the Washington State Auditor. So it will have a lot of the regulations and the way the budget itself is structured as like programs, activities, object codes, those type things, the way it's set up. We have fund accounting in school districts. Basically, we have 5 accounts. They're all separate accounts and they all have special purposes. The funds cannot be intermingled among most of these accounts. General fund can pick up expenditures in other funds, but transportation vehicle fund cannot pay for ASB or debt service or anything else. It's only for that particular purpose. So each account has a balance in here. We'll talk about those. We're really going to spend most of our time talking about general fund. That's our largest fund and the one that we use for operating. But there's capital projects. Real simply, that's for building repairs and technology. Debt service fund, it's for paying for long-term debt. Normally it's through a bond process. We don't have a bond, but we do have a loan from the state of Washington for energy retrofits, and it has to be paid by the debt service fund. Since we have no revenue in debt service because there is no bonds, we transfer the amount from the capital projects fund each year to pay that payment. So we'll talk about it later. Then there's the Associated Student Body Fund. It's funds generated by students and revenue and expenditures are approved by students. And the last is Transportation Vehicle Fund. It's a reimbursement fund when we buy school buses to purchase more school buses. General Fund, it is our largest fund, and we're budgeting a little over $22.5 million in the coming year for that particular fund. The revenue from that comes from lots of different places. It's local funds, county funds, state, federal funds. Think of it as your operating fund. If it's your home budget, it's the things that you are paying for to operate your house. All schools must have a general fund. They don't have to have the other 4 funds. We also have a private trust fund that I report that's used for scholarships. That is not a budgeted fund in the F-195 because that is local funds for a specific purpose. So there is no budget you'll find in this for that. And then when we talk about building budgets, there's the considerations that we have to look at. And that's our vision, our mission, and our values. And those don't really show up as line items. They may, but really it's an underlying philosophical viewpoint of how we build our budget. What does our program look like based upon the needs of our students? What does the structure look like? We have a traditional classroom education program. We have a local in-person alternative learning environment. We have an online learning environment for kids. We have Southwood Academy at the high school that supports students in a different way. So it's the resources we use to build those structures that support the needs of our students to prepare them for, a multiculturally engaged future. When we think about our ethnic studies class that we added, it's specifically for that purpose, right? It's those type things, or it's the curriculum adoption we're doing so that we're making sure that the information that we have and we're sharing with kids is current, up to date, really reflecting what it is that we want our kids to know in order for them to go out into the bigger world and understand what's happening around them. It's the training we provide for our staff, whether it's equity training or if it's inclusion or whatever else it might be, differentiated instruction, whatever it is that we're providing our teachers to prepare them to do a better job of meeting our vision and mission. And the current year, we spent quite a bit of money updating literature to make sure that it really represented our students and that it wasn't the traditional look at what society was like. So we put quite a bit of money into our libraries, buying new books that are new, relevant, and, you know, helps kids with that, you know, engagement and becoming more active. And the other thing I'd like to mention is that in the collaboration with our community, you know, we created an ALE program that's local that really, the basis of that is collaboration with community. They bring in a lot of community people for classes, for activities, for collaboration, whether it's working in the wetland and a biologist shows up or what it might be. So there's a lot of collaboration that we're putting resources towards in that type of a program. Our garden program is another great example of that same type of collaboration of how we want to do it. So that's really the budget considerations is, you know, it's more of an underpinning of the process rather than it's, you know, line 72 has $200,000 for curriculum. Yes, I know it does, but it's really, how do we get to that point?
I just want to note, I love that you know what line that is and can call it out.
This is my life, sorry. Budget development, there's basically 5 major components in creating the budget. And we talk about students a lot. And when I talk about them in the funding world, it's really about dollars. And I know some people may take offense to that, but in the prototypical school funding model, it's about money. It's really how do we get money? So students are really the top priority in this whole process of figuring out what our budget looks like. Once we know what our enrollment should be, then we can look at our revenue, because a lot of the revenue is driven by enrollment. Once we know what our revenue is, we know what our student enrollment looks like, then we start looking at our staffing. What do we need? How many first grade classrooms we have based upon the number of kids we have? What classes do the high school students need in order to graduate? How many teachers we need for support for prep periods or whatever it might be. It starts building the program based upon the staffing needs, and the staffing needs are based on student needs. And you understand when we get to the expenditure costs, that our payroll is 85% of our budget. So it's a big piece of our budget. And then we get into supplies and services, you know, things like, I know that our insurance is going up by $40,000. Fixed, can't change that. You know, I know our utility costs are getting a 3% increase in their rate. So there's all these pieces we start building in to understand our supplies and services. And then finally, we have to think about fund balance. What is our fund balance? What can we use? And what do we need for cash flows and emergencies? And the reason we need a fund balance is that half of the year, our expenditures exceed our revenue. It's just the way the structure is of the apportionment payment schedule by the state. You'll see that it fluctuates from 5% to 12.5%. So it isn't an even 1/12 every month. So we can't say that we're going to get the same amount. Even if our payroll is the same every month, our revenue is not. So we need cash flow to cover those months when it doesn't work. We also need cash flow if our estimates for enrollment are off, because we'll talk about how that works later, but you know, we need that safety net basically. One thing I want to remind people is that when we talk about this budget, we're really talking about estimates. We're not talking about a fixed budget that says we will have $20 million no matter what. It's based upon enrollment. About 15 million of the 20 million is based on enrollment. And we get paid from September through December based on the enrollment estimates that we provide through this budget process. In January through June, OSPI then reevaluates based on our actual enrollment and either raises the amount they give us or they decrease. So you always want to be at the place where you don't have a decrease in your funding come January, because a lot of our costs are already fixed. If you think about it, after May 15th, any contract we have with a certificated employee is in place for the year. We can't do anything with that. I can't do anything about the $276,000 we pay for insurance. It's a fixed cost. It isn't going to change no matter how many kids we have. So there's a lot of those type pieces in there that we have to be real sure that we're not overestimating student enrollment. It's the one way that can really cause problems for a school district. There's the official F-195 budget. It's still preliminary, but it's sitting in OSPI. It's on our website if anybody wants to look at it. It is about 216 pages long, very dry, but it has a lot more information if you want to really dive down into the line item detail information. So it is available by going to our website and you can look at that. So we talk about enrollment. That's where we start in the whole budget process, because like I said, students drive the state funding, and it's through the prototypical school funding model. And I'll explain how that works a little bit so that you understand that. But before we figure out what enrollment looks like for next year, we have to look at where have we been. And you can see that we started in the 80s and we were a growing district, quite dramatically growing until about the year 2000. And then for the last 22 years, we have been declining, some years much faster than others. There's some very steep drops about 2010, a year ago, some of those things that are pretty dramatic. But we have gone from roughly 2265 to about 1165. So we're about half the size we were in 2000. So as we build the budget, we have to take this into consideration, that we have to modify what we do. We can't be a district that just rolls the budget forward and say, okay, it's a 2% increase in everything for the coming year, because it just doesn't work. We don't have those funds. So we really have to look at how are we spending our money, and each year, and dive into, did we spend what we thought we were going to, or we're going to spend more? What are the needs that are coming up that are different than the needs we had last year, and all those things. So these are 5-year looks at our enrollment. And I do this because it gives me information, and that's really what I'm looking for. You can look at the bottom line, and yes, our enrollment has dropped each 5 years, like 200, 400, 200, that type of thing. But I started looking also at class sizes, and I see that in 2000, we had our smallest class was 126 kindergartners, and our largest was 263 kids coming in as freshmen. Next 5 years, that number drops to 95 and 219, that drops to 71 and 132. And you can see how that progression goes down, and that the number that's coming in at the top, it's much smaller than the numbers that were there before, and smaller than the ones that are there. So it kind of gives us an idea of where we're going. The other thing it does with it is we look at this, we also have to look at programs. We have multiple programs that use enrollment numbers. Basic education, we'll start with that one. It's our largest, but I started looking at trends last 3 years. Okay, if we take the third graders in 2019-20, there was 84 of them. The next year there was 90, so we actually gained. This year they dropped to 76. So you have that fluctuation. So when we look at, methodologies, we can say, well, what if you just rolled everybody forward? Well, by looking at this, you can see it doesn't happen that way. A big example is always the change between the sophomore and junior year. You look at it depending upon the year, 15, 25 kids. Well, it's kids that have their graduation requirements done and are going to Running Start, or are getting them together, or whatever. So there's always that number. So I know that I can't just roll the sophomore class into a junior class and have that as a legitimate number. Sometimes that works. If you look at the 5th grade in 2019-20, 88.46, 86.56, 87.88, that one was pretty steady. Didn't really change much. But if you look at others, there's dramatic changes. 6th grade from 94 to 74 to 84. So there's quite a change in there. But what it does is it starts giving you information that you can use to look at where are we going. The other part of it is ALE. We started a new program this year. Traditionally, we had a few kids doing online through Spokane School District. It's an online virtual academy. They provide the teacher, they provide the content, everything. We really don't do anything. So it's kind of like an independent learning situation. But we added a local program, brought in about 64 more kids, created another dynamic, but also created more cost, more staffing, more things that we had to do with that. So the question is, brand new program, where does it go next year? Looking at it, half of the kids were kids that were in our traditional program. So I'm not expecting a huge jump next year. I'm thinking we captured what we were going to capture, and now it looks like one of our other programs, and will most likely act very similar to our traditional programs as far as probably getting smaller over time as our total enrollment becomes smaller. Or it might be kids move back and forth. And that's what I found a lot this year, is that we had a lot of kids that would try this and then come back, or try that and go. So it didn't change our FTE, but there's this movement between programs. So we can roll them over. We know that doesn't work. So we look at cohort survival, and that's what we talked about. You know, the third graders became fourth graders, became fifth graders. What happened? And you can see that, okay, in this class over 3 years, we started with 100 kids, we ended with 98. So it's 98% coefficient, multiply that times the number of kids we get next year's, that kind of thing. We can also weight it, say, okay, we really believe that what happened 3 years ago pre-pandemic is more important than what happened last year. So let's give that a little more weight, or vice versa, that last year was more important, we can weight that more. So there's a variety of ways. I look at this half a dozen different models, different timelines to come up with what I expect that our enrollment will be. So based on that, you know, we're currently with the ALE have 1165. I think we're going to be at about 1112 next year. Because if we look at our current year kindergarten and first grade, you see that they are both in the mid 50 range. If we expect that to happen next year, and right now, as of the end of June, we had about 30 kids signed up for kindergarten again, which is about what we had last year at this time. I would anticipate we're probably going to be in that same place. We also look at the 2020 census data, and we know we have fewer kids under the age of 5 in 2020 than we did in 2010. So that demographic of the community here becoming older with fewer kids is showing up in the data too, which also would lead me to believe that we're probably accurate in thinking that it, you know, 55 or whatever, 56 next year is probably a fair number. I'd feel uncomfortable trying to go above that at this point. We talk about the years out. I don't really even want to talk about those because so many things could change in 1 year. I have to do this for the state, and it's really for our legislators who want to try to look at trends. And it's fine for a lot of places, but it doesn't work well in our particular district because of the circumstances we have. We'll talk about those in the budget process. But if you look at our pattern, it just doesn't work well with the information they're requesting. But once we know what we believe what the enrollment looks like, then we break it down even further. We need to know how many kids are going to be in kindergarten, first grade, et cetera, because that drives how many teachers we need. You know, if we say we want 22 kids in a classroom and we have 52 kids in first grade, then what do we do with that? If you have 2 classrooms, you're at 26, 27, too many. If you have 3, you're way below, we can't afford it. So we start looking at multi-age. Okay, let's have 2 first grade, 2 second grade, and have a K1 or something like that to absorb that difference. So that's how we start talking about what are our staffing needs at the high school level. Okay, here's the number of kids we have. What classes do they need to take? How do we accomplish that? And it all builds into that process. And then how many of those kids that are ALE are actually going to be here? Because we're going to need to staff those as opposed to those that are going to Spokane, who we do nothing for. We sign them up and they're off on their own. So it's a different activity for us. So we use this information to really start building program and staffing. We do this early in the spring and say, okay, at the 5th grade level with 73 kids, you're going to get 3 teachers and you're going to have 24 or 25 kids in your classroom. And that's the expectation. Then we look at the collective bargaining agreement and see how that falls in line with what's in there to make sure that it's working and, you know, all those type of things. So just to look at enrollment and went back 4 years, the 2 averages are actual. So you see that we went from, if we use the subtotal before running start and ALE, it's 1248, 1158, 1088, and looking at 1047. And then you can add the ALE in the bottom part of the running start. Running start students, we get the funding for that, but then we pay the community college. So we could budget for 100 or 1,000, it wouldn't make any difference because it's just a flow through for us. It really is. But 27 is what we currently have roughly this particular year. So when we talk about student enrollment and the importance, this is why. This is the approximate amount that we get for every 1 FTE, so a full-time student in each of these programs. So in our traditional program, if for every student that's here, you know, 5 days a week, we get $10,482.19. Special ed, ALE, and our vocational program all have rates. Running Start has rates. There's rates for everything. But it gives you an idea of the importance of what our FTE actually means. So if we drop,
And real
Yes.
quick, just to clarify, that special education number is only up to 13.5% of the total district population.
That is correct.
And so any in excess special education identified beyond that 13.5 does not receive that funding.
You are correct. And, so if we're operating at 16%, let's say, which is kind of where we've been recently. Yes, there are students that we are not receiving funding for because it does cap it at 13.5%. That is true. So the number I used to create this budget in our basic education program, 1,047.59, and FTE full-time equivalent. So that's a student that goes every day, all day. The ALE program, which is 64.16, and that does include the Spokane Virtual Academy. There's a piece in there. Special education, we're at about 181 this year, and it looks like we'll be very similar to next year. 27 for Running Start. The vocational program at the high school, about 62 kids is where we are currently. And we have about 6 individuals in our bilingual transitional program. So it's another one of those factors that we get budgeted dollars for. Staffing units. Then we start talking about staffing units. And we talk about those, and rather than calling them employees, we're in a funding model that doesn't refer to employees, they refer to staffing units. It's very dry. They have 3 different classifications, and they all get funded differently, and they have different mechanisms in there, so they have to be calculated differently. The first is instructional certificated staff, and think of that as a teacher. Anybody that has a certificate, could be a librarian, could be a nurse, could be a counselor, but anybody that has a teaching certificate. Then we have our classified staff. Our paraeducators, our secretaries, bus drivers, maintenance, transportation, food service, district office people, those that don't have a certificate to the state of Washington. And finally, the certificated staff, which is building principals, the superintendent, and myself. So this is just a comparison between the current year budget and what next year's budget would look like with each of those. And you can see they're broken down by activities. There's 3 ways that OSPI categorize things: program, activity, and object code. Activity is kind of what it says. It's what are they doing? So teaching, if you look at that, certificated, that is your classroom teachers. If they have a 27, they're in a classroom, you can see that there's reduction in there, and that's the process we went through in the fall, or the spring, I mean. And then on the right side for classified, that's basically your paraeducators. Those are in a classroom, they're teaching. If they're in a library, they'd be under learning resources. If they're a registrar and they're classified, they'd be under counseling, and all the different categories that we have. The one thing I do want to point out is when we talk about FTE for certificated staff, normally most certificated staff are a 1.0 FTE. So we're talking about, full people. When you talk about classified staff, they're based on a 2,080 hour, which is a 260-day, 8-hour-a-day, year-round schedule. So most of our people here, paraeducator, you might only be a 0.53 because you're working 6 hours a day, 183 days a year, or whatever it might be, that type of thing. So even though it says 14.989, we're not talking about 15 people. We're probably talking about 30 people, that type of thing. The other thing is that this is what we're budgeting. This is not what we're getting funded for. So there's a big difference between these two. But it just gives you a comparison of where we budgeted for this year and what we're budgeting for next year. You'll see a lot of these activities, you don't see certificated staff, and that's mostly your support programs, food service, operations, which is transportation, bus drivers, maintenance, grounds, custodial, information systems, those type things. And then the second page is basically your building principals and their office staff. And then everything that doesn't fit within that is called central administration. So the superintendent's office, business office, HR, your budget falls within here. And then some of the supervisors for different programs all fall within there. So it's just a way of looking at where are we putting our staffing resources. On the revenue side, we have basically 5 main revenue sources. The first is local property taxes. Then there's the local funds generated by the district, in district. We'll talk about what those are. There's state apportionment, which is based upon the enrollment. There's state funding for categorical programs, which is also based upon enrollment, and we'll talk about those. And then there's federal funding. And when I talk about categorical programs, basically what I mean by that is we get funding for a specific purpose, say special education. that money has to be spent in special education. And there's requirements around that. And if we don't spend it, we have to send the money back. There's a recovery process in those programs. Unlike the state apportionment, there's no recovery process. We could get $20 million and spend 15 million and we keep the $5 million. There's no way that they bring that money back normally. So it's just a different way of looking at where the funds are coming from and the purpose of those funds. So we'll talk about each of those a little bit. So we start breaking that down. You'll see that the state general, the 56.2 is our state apportionment. It's based upon enrollment. The state special at 14.6 or those other categorical programs state funded, again, most of those are based on enrollment, or in transportation's case, it's ridership. And then we have federal funds at 10.2, which is much larger than we see in a normal year. And that's due to the ESSER funds, which is a several year program. Then our local property taxes about 16.3% and our local non-tax at 2.7%. At one time, our local property tax was about 24% of our budget. So that has changed over the year after the McCleary decision. And it actually was to the detriment of the district. And we'll talk about that also.
A quick question about the pie chart.
Yeah.
Is this for the school year that just ended or for next year? Because I thought that ESSER funds ended.
No, this is for the coming year, the 22-23 school year. ESSER funds, technically, they end at different times. The majority of them we will spend through the 22-23 school year. We could potentially, there are a few that could go a year longer, but I think we're going to spend them all by the end of the year. So we're spending some in the current year. There's very few in the previous year, and then the rest in the coming year. So yes, that will go back. Normally, you're looking at maybe 6% of your budget being federal funds in a normal year. Normally, we get $950,000. And in the current year, we had budgeted 2.9 million because there was about 2 million that came in. We're not spending all of it. We're carrying about half of it over into 22-23 to spend it then. So federal funds will look different in 23-24.
Thank you. And then for the use or lose funds, and tell me if you're going to get into this, do we have plans to spend it all?
Yes.
Great.
Yes. We have never had, during my time here, we have never had funds recovered for not spending them. You can roll a percentage over into, and sometimes we will do that if we don't spend them all, but it's usually, a small percentage that you can do that too. But it's one of the things I started looking at in early spring is, where are we on the expenditures for special education, which is never a problem, for the learning assistance program, for the title programs, for all these programs to see, we want to spend all this money by the end of the year. And, are we going to make it? Have we met our minimum expenditure criteria for our CTE program? It's one of those programs that you have to spend a certain amount of the funding. So, where are we on that? And then I follow that all through the spring and summer to make sure that we do spend, funds appropriately and that we get, to keep that funding. So.
Well, and to add to that, Dan, like the categorical programs are also the portion of education. When we talk about education that's still not being fully funded, they're talking about categorical programs. So for example, Dan, just doing rough estimates, special education is already starting out in the hole by about 237,000 just from day one, because it's not fully funded. And so when you look at your EL programs, your highly capable programs, all of those different pieces, those are not fully funded by the state or by the federal government.
Yeah, and I'll point out a couple of little places in the budget as we talk about it, but there's a lot of things in this prototypical school funding model that does not really provide the amount of money that school districts need. And, they're working on it, but it's a slow process to improve. That answer your question, Joe?
It did. Thank you.
Just a quick look at how each of those sources compared to the previous 2 years. You can see that the levy is about the same. It doesn't change. And I'll talk about the levy because, it's a concern for me for a district like ours. And there's specific reasons why. The local non-tax, we'll talk about why that's increasing. You can see that the state general Basically, it's a decrease over time predominantly, and that's tied to enrollment of students. State special continues to increase a bit. A lot of that had to do with one, special education, and two, our poverty percentage has to do with how our LAP funds and some of the other programs are generated. So when that changes, then it goes up. And OSBI did something this year in the budget process. They allowed us to go back and do a hold harmless to 1920. So we could use some of the numbers from several years ago in some of these programs to generate revenue, which generated more revenue than we would have normally seen had we gone through the regular process. So it's one of the things they threw in there. Levy was an example. They allowed us to use a higher student number in order to calculate our levy for the coming year. And some of the other programs did the same thing, but so that has a variation. But you'll see at the far right, the federal, that big jump, that's ESSER funds that came in, the $2 million. We're not going to spend it all. We're going to spend about half of it, which is the green on the right side. But again, once we get through, we're going to drop back down to that lower level. And so, we are currently using $1 million of federal funds on an annual basis that we will have to adjust in our budget that won't be here a year from now. So our local levy is now called an enrichment levy. It was a change after McCleary. What do we use it for? Well, it's used for a lot of things. It's our athletic programs. We pay our coaches out of there, the travel costs for the teams, field trips, anything that is not paid for by the state. We also pay for staff that are not funded or underfunded. When I talk about not funded, they give us a certain number of staff based upon the number of students we have. It's never the same amount that we actually have. There's always more staff than there. So we're paying that. And then underfunded, I'll show you a little later how much we're receiving from the state for each classification that we talked about in those staffing units and how that has changed over time. But we pick up a percentage of that for every single employee. So, we use levy funds to pay for those. And then things are just underfunded, utilities, insurance, things in the MSOCs. And then we have our programs like food service, pupil transportation. We always spend more in those programs than we generate in revenue. And again, when we talk about our priorities, where do we put our resources? Well, feeding kids is one of those. We know it's going to cost us $250,000 to provide, our food service program for kids. But if we didn't do that, and it's not required, neither one of those required services, we'd have a lot of kids who weren't having adequate nutrition. So again, it's putting our money where we believe our values are. And then anything that's negotiated, healthcare increases, paid leave, vacation pay, tri-pay, et cetera, et cetera. All those things that are not funded by the state are picked up by the levy. The other thing is we have a voter approved levy amount, and then we have a authorization by the state of Washington based upon the regulations that they have. And a great example in 2022, the voters approved $4,019,000. We could only collect $3,519,049 due to that levy authority by the state. And for our district, the South Woodby School District real estate value within the district is astronomically high compared to a lot of districts. Last time I looked, which is a year ago, is $600.5 billion. It's probably well over $7 by now, which basically means there's two options for levies. One is a rate per thousand. And because our value is so high, we're not allowed to do that because it would put us at an unfair advantage that we could collect, $20 million in levy proceeds, right? So we're limited to a per student amount. And this is where that creates a problem for the South Woodby School District. Even though that amount increases by the CPI each year, goes up 2% or whatever to that rate of 2878.66, the number of students go down. So as that students go down, our levy stays basically the same. And we talked about what are we using levies for? Well, we're using them for coaching salaries. Well, they have a salary schedule with an increase in it based on IPD. We use it for staff not funded, underfunded. Again, salary increases based on IPD. So those costs continue to rise, but this levy amount stays the same over a long period of time just because of the way it's calculated. So if we combine the two, and levies work on a calendar year basis, so they're a January through December. We're again on a fiscal base from September to August, which basically means we collect levies from two different school years. In the fall, we collect the 2022 levy, and in the spring, we collect half of their 58% of the 2023 levy. So there's this overlap in there. So if you do that comparison, we end up with about, $3.46 million is what we're able to collect in the coming school year. And you can see what that does for us. So it has become this kind of stagnant revenue stream. We dropped from over $4 million to 3.7, and that's part of that McCleary situation. And then we dropped to where we are today, which is roughly 3.4 million. And it's pretty much stayed there. So we're not generating additional revenue to offset the additional costs as they escalate over time. So that creates a bit of an issue for us in the budgeting process is how do we make up that difference? So if you look at the money, it's basically there's property taxes, and then the county actually breaks it down to timber excise tax and local taxes and some other things. But the bottom line is really what we're looking at. You can see that it's very similar. It would have been less this year, except for that hold harmless going back to 1920, which allowed us to collect a larger amount for the particular living year. Then we have the local non-tax. This is stuff that we generate in-house. So it's donations. School Foundation gives us $70,000, whatever. It's the rental fees from the community center. It's a local food service fee. If we look at the revenue later, you'll see there's $100,000 this year for local food service. Well, that's a change from the free and reduced for everybody to we're going back to paying for things. Student fees, the traffic safety driver's ed program, sale and resale of goods. So if you're in shop class and you buy wood, we buy it and sell it to you, that type of thing. And then investment earnings, which, yay, it's going up, with the interest rates climbing, that's creating more revenue for us. And just a quick breakdown of kind of what those look like. So you can see, we have traffic safety, we have the sales. The food service is the fourth one down. You see that, in 1920, we had about $94,000 in revenue. And then we moved into the pandemic area where the federal government picked up all food service costs. So every meal was free for every child. So there was no local money anymore. It all ended up in the federal dollars. And now we'll be back next year to, if you don't qualify for free and reduced, you are a paid student. And we anticipate to start collecting revenue from that again. Investment earnings, probably half of what or twice as what we budgeted for this year. There was a big jump in the last month as far as what the investment amount from the county came back in. So that was nice to see. And then donations, pretty standard. We did have a drop there kind of during that first pandemic year where we shut down and things didn't really happen. So I expect that to come back up. Rentals and leases, that's predominantly the community center. You see in 1920, we were at $291,000. It dropped again as people shut down and stopped operating for a while. We're ramping back up, and I think we'll be fully operational by then. Same thing with traffic safety. You can see that it basically disappeared in 2021. It started up about a month ago, so it is back operating, and by next year should be fully operating.
And so I had that question, seeing the jump from for both traffic safety education fees and sales of goods, supplies, services unassigned from the 1920 numbers, like doubling from there or tripling in the case of traffic safety education fees. Is that going back to pre-pandemic numbers, or
Yeah,
what's the cause for that?
pre-pandemic,
jump?
we were closer to 50,000 for traffic safety and those type things. And just so you know, in these type of programs, they're basically cost neutral to the district. Is we will budget 60,000 in revenue, 60,000 in expenditures. Traffic safety pays for itself. It's not technically a district funded program. Yeah, kind of the same thing with sales of goods. We budget 50,000 in both categories. If we have nothing, it doesn't affect anything. It doesn't change the budget. So a lot of these programs, now food service, certainly that would affect the budget if we didn't get, any money coming in. But a lot of those type things are like that. So yeah, what I'm really looking at is I think we'll be fully operational by next year. A lot of these programs that shut down for a while or reduced because of the pandemic should be back in full swing. I fully expect that community center will be fully operating 100% by then. Traffic safety's back, et cetera, et cetera. Then state apportionment. This is really kind of the big thing that we talk about because this is where the bulk of our money comes from. And we use a prototypical school funding model. There's basically two primary drivers in this. The first is that there's the funded staffing units, which is based on enrollment. So if you have 400 kids, you get so many teachers, et cetera. And then we look at how much is allocated per each staffing unit. And we do that multiplication and it tells you how much money we're going to generate. So an example is when elementary school is 400 kids, they will allocate 1.253 funding units for principals, half for a counselor, 1.67 for a custodian. And, you think about it, we probably have, well, I know we have 2 custodians in this building. We have a full-time counselor. So what we're funded at isn't necessarily what we staff at. We staff based on needs. They staff on a funding formula.
Which is a good thing because a couple of years ago I ran the numbers and the health services at those rates would be about 5 minutes per student in our district per year.
Yeah.
And that assumes 0 planning time.
Yeah.
Like they're just so wildly out of touch with reality, especially for a small rural district. It's
Yeah. And those 2 areas, health services and guidance counselors, they've increased those numbers slightly this year. It's not a huge difference from these, but it doesn't. Yeah, you don't have a full-time nurse at an elementary school at a 0.135, and we do need those services. We actually have a full-time classified nurse at the elementary level, and we have the equivalent of 1 full-time health assistant at the elementary level. So, and we have a, full-time certificated nurse at the high school level. So we staff more than what we are required and what we're funded by, because that's what the need is.
which
So
gets
we
back
looked
to
at-
what Andrea was saying about here's where we need additional funds from the levy and other things. Yeah. And what you were saying.
Yeah, and that's how where we
Well,
put our
or
resources.
the legislature could fully fund education and eliminate the need for levies.
Which would be wonderful.
Yeah, it would be. So when we look at the staffing allocation, enrollment drives the number of staffing units. And then we look at what do they multiply that by? What's the dollar amount? And there's 3 parts to it. There's a base salary allocation, which is the same that every district across the state receives for each of those 3 classifications we talked about. There's a regionalization number, which is different for every district, and ours started at 24, went down to 18 for the coming year. And then there's an experience factor, which is only our certificated instructional staff, because we are well above the state average as far as, how many years of experience does our teaching staff have? And so they realize that, you pay more based on experience. And so that, you needed more money. It used to be a thing where they paid you based on the education and experience of every single teacher individually, so that as you had more experience in education, they would give you more money. And that was different in every district. So they changed the model, and this is what they're using. So if we look at this, you'll see that on the top, the year, the regionalization going from 24 to 18, experience factor stayed the same. You add up those 3 allocations, you come down to a dollar amount. And you see in 1920, it was $85,146. Didn't really change for the next 3 years. And this year, because of the 5.5% IPD, it went to 88,728, a little bit of a jump, but you have to also balance that with a 7.8% salary increase for certificated staff. But then I looked at what do we spend? And this is each year is a little different because there's a different staffing placement as far as who do we have. But you see that in 1920, we were receiving a little over 85,000, paying a little over 90,000, and the state was funding about 94.2% of the salary, not of the number of people, but on their allocation model. Currently, it dropped to 83.8%. So a big difference of what the district is picking up. And then we go back to the levy, where the levy isn't increasing. So where is that money coming from? And that's why we have to talk about making reductions and changes to program and all those things, because somehow we have to pick this up, right? Number of staff, whatever it is that we're doing. But it's one of those things that this has not been, this particular school funding model has not been helpful for South Whidbey, in that it was regressive in the regionalization, and then we also have enrollment decline on top of that, so it creates a real issue for us. You kind of see the blue line pretty much flat. That's our funding, where the red, you can see the increases each year where people move up on salary schedules, they more experience, more education, they move up. The negotiated agreement, the IPD increases, all those things causes salaries to go over time. I also looked at what if there was no change to regionalization? Is the state still funding us at 94.2%? Well, no, it really drops to 87.9. So what the state is funding isn't matching what the salary increases are equated to. So it's just looking at it a little different way of, how are we doing and what are we doing? Would have loved to stayed at that 24%, but that isn't what we had. And it wasn't just for certificate staff. When I look at classified administrative staff, I look at the percentage funding before, and then look at the change. You can see that it happens across all three classifications at different rates, but it's a direct result of that regionalization reduction and then salaries exceeding IPD. So if you think about it, if we get an IPD of 2%, most salary collective bargaining agreements will say IPD plus 8%, whatever that percent might be. So it's always more than we're going to receive. And we only receive it in part of our people. So it's part of that issue that, and it's really, levy is one of those big issues for us. If it had been increasing over time, like traditionally it had, because we could ask for a dollar amount times the value of the property. So as values of property went up, we could collect more levy funds. And, we were at 4.2 million, we'd probably be at 4.7 million, difference of, $1 million at least by this time, had we stayed with the traditional formula. But it isn't what we have, but that's where we're getting these problems that we're running into when we talk about the difference. And then we talk about state projections. And these are all the enrollment-based one. And there's another document out there, which they call the F203. It's just all the calculations that OSPI uses to come up with the dollar amounts that they will give us if we really have that number of students next year. If you really like to dig into detail, this one is full of it. It's really convoluted though. There's a lot of information that I have to enter into this. It's all the enrollment numbers for all the different programs, it's salary, it's benefits, it's poverty amounts, state recovery amounts. There's like 4 pages of these type of things that I have to calculate in order to put into their system. But then it generates this, and it's 40 pages of calculations. And this is an example of certificated instructional staff. So based on the number of students we have, they will fund us for 53.52 certificated staff members at that state allocation of $72,728. And then they add on the 18% for regionalization, the 4% for experience, and they come up with a dollar amount. When you read this, it's really odd because what they do is they use last year's numbers first. And then they come up with that first number, $4.3 million or $4.2 million. And then they do it with the current year number. And then they subtract that from the previous year to get the difference. And then they add them together. Why they don't do one calculation, I don't know. But it's just the way they do things. And it's throughout the document. But, they do this for certificated instructional staff. The one below is administrative staff. There's one for classified staff. So they create a dollar amount based on the staffing units times the allocation. And then they apply benefits to it. So with that 53.52 certificated instructional staff, 4.045 administrative staff, they add those together and they multiply them by a dollar amount for insurance. And they come up with an amount that they will give the district for the insurance part of SEB. The second one is basically benefits. They take the dollar amounts, multiply by say 23%, and that's for your FICA, Medicare, and retirement. They give you that dollar amount, and they keep adding those together. And then they do the material supplies, operating costs, MSOCs. They take the number of kids times these ratios, and they come up with dollar amounts in each of these categories, technology, utilities, curriculum, et cetera. You can spend them any way you want, but it's how they create those dollar amounts. You add all that stuff together and then you come out with these summaries. This is what they are funding us for salaries, benefits, et cetera, down the categories. Percentage of that goes to special education. And this isn't the state categorical special education fund. This is the apportionment special education fund. And that changes from year to year based on those percentages of the number of kids and all those things. So it's some years it's much larger, some years it's much less, depending upon the numbers. But it gives you these what they call guaranteed entitlement, but they're only guaranteed in June of 2023. That's when you know what those numbers really are, because they change them for those 6 months period. But that's the bulk, the big part of what our funding looks like. It's over half of our funding. So that's enrollment, that's categorical or not categorical, could be used for anything in those two areas. It has to be in those areas. And it gives you that breakdown. And you can see that it's, again, because enrollment driven, it continues to kind of decline over time. The lower part of this is the other categorical programs is also based on enrollment. So you have your special education, 181 students will generate $1,682,567. You add that 306,000, say they're at $2 million and we're spending 2.5. So when Director Downs talked about that underfunding of these programs, that's a prime example. And then we get money for the learning assistance, which is basically remediation. We use it in this building for a variety of, reading and things like that. Yes.
Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're also still funding special education differently depending on what least restrictive environment category they fall into. So students who are more, and it was done with the purpose of building more inclusionary models, but our students who are more incorporated into the general education environment receive more funding than students who are in self-contained programs.
That is correct.
And that is still continuing.
That is continuing. And what I find is that it's good they fund it a little higher because our costs are higher because it requires more people when you start bringing kids out into classrooms as opposed to confining them.
But even still, the max that student would generate would be 20,000, where if the student requires a one-to-one paraeducator, the actual cost to educate that student is closer to 70 to 80 to 100,000.
You are absolutely correct. Yes.
Hence why our legislation needs to fund special education fully, please.
Yeah. So these are all the categorical programs where we have to spend them in particular places. Transitional bilingual, we get $9,000 and provide, services for about 6 kids are highly capable. Transportation operations, again, we were fortunate. They allowed a hold harmless for that to go back to 1920, where we could collect a larger percentage than we would have, because normally it's based on our ridership. And as we get smaller, there's fewer kids riding the bus, we get less money. You can see in 2021, it actually went to 677 because of ridership issues. So there's those programs. The 100,000 that's under 4,300, that is budget capacity. That is unknown funds that we might get in a grant. There's a revenue expenditure that balances. So if we don't get it, we don't spend it, but it gives me capacity so I don't have to go back and do a budget revision for at least this dollar amount. So anyways, you can see that it's, it's pretty similar to last year's budget, much less than, we saw in 1920. So those numbers, because they are enrollment based, continue to go down. Then we have federal special purpose money. And these are my nightmare. If you ever get an audit finding as a district, it's because of these programs. There are a lot of compliance, audited every year by the state auditors, very specific use of what these funds can be used for. There's a lot of rules around purchasing, expenditures, time and effort, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but you can see the point here is that, 1920, $960,000, very typical year for us. That's about what we normally would get, because most of these programs are special education, title programs, food service, which is the free and reduced reimbursements, those type things. Then we have the ESSER funds, which actually started in 2021. We collected $86,000 in the first year with the first round of ESSERs. We have budgeted for about $2 million in the current year, knowing we were going to spend about half of that because I'm saving half of it for 22-23. But again, once we get past 22-23, those funds are gone unless there's another round coming out of the federal government. I'd be really surprised if we see that. So, we're dropping from almost 2.2 million to probably closer to $1 million. So there's $1.2 million in funds there that we're not going to have that we are using currently. So we will have to, in the budget process, and we look at the 4-year review, we can kind of see that issue, that we have to start talking about how do we make those changes. And then just a summary based on all those, that we're about $21.2 million. And you can see that it really didn't change much other than that, kind of pandemic year when we, had a drop in a few things, but basically our local funds. But really, our revenue doesn't change much over time. So even though there's an IPD increase, the drop in regionalization, the flat levy amount, we're pretty much bouncing around at the same, $21 million level while our expenditures continue to increase. So that's why we're talking in the fall about how do we use resources, including our facilities. So expenses. OSBI categorizes expenses in 3 different classifications. There's program, activity, and object code. And it's kind of the granular look at things. So when you look at program, you're looking at it across all areas within that program, all classifications. So when we talk about basic education, that's our traditional program. You can see that we're looking at $10,525,623. And then there's our ALE expenditures. You'll see that those more than doubled. Basically because we guessed this year. We had no idea what the cost was going to be for that program. We're generating almost $600,000 in it, but I'm expecting that we're going to spend closer to $400,000 as far as the opportunities and things that we're doing with it. So in current year, that came out of Program 01, but it clearly identify where that cost is. It's in there. And then you have the federal money, the ESSER funds, all those type things. We did receive, if you look at that Fund 11, $664,332. We received that in May, and we have to show that we expend that by next August. So that's why it's in the budget as an expenditure, because I have to report to OSPI how I spent that money that we received in the current year. So basically, it's part of the fund balance. It allowed fund balance to rise by that amount to be used in the following year. And then we have our special education program, we have our vocational program, and not much difference in most of those. If there's a difference, it's because of the enrollment number. The vocational program, the number went up a little bit as far as number of students, so it creates a higher cost and higher revenue.
I'd love to see more students in vocational programs. I think that's fantastic.
I think it's great too. I'm a real proponent of hands-on. And then we have moving into more of the grant-based, next section, it's your title programs, which is remediation, learning assistance, remediation type things. And then a variety of other, the 69 program is basically our CPWI program that's run out of the community center. There's stuff like that. And then we have traffic safety, highly capable, community services at the community center. It's predominantly the cost of that. And you see that, it has gone up. Expecting that we're going to be fully operational and there's going to be more expenditures in there. And then there's a district-wide support. That's everything that they have in what they call Program 97. So that's going to start with the board of directors budget, the superintendents, the business office, the HR, custodial, maintenance, everything that's kind of a district-wide cost as opposed to being assigned to a building. There's our school food services program. And again, expecting that if participation stays the same, we do pay for a food service management company that is based upon a price per meal. So if the same number of meals are being served, then I anticipate the cost to go up. If it doesn't, then, it won't, that type of thing. Just informational, we operate our food service program a little different than some. All employees of the nutrition program are district employees. The only one who is not is Rachel, who is a food service employee for the food service management company. And then we pay the employee costs and they pay the meal costs. So they buy the food and all that stuff, and then we just reimburse them on a meal price. We are, or will be, in the last year of our contract with them. We'll have to go out for bid again and see where that goes, assuming that we want to continue with a food service management company in the coming year. And then the people transportation, that's our school buses. That's just the operation of getting kids to and from school and all the things that go with that. Anticipating that we will have an increase in fuel costs. Our last fuel bill for diesel was very expensive. Yeah, so I'm hoping that changes because, normally we had been paying in the $2 range and we were almost $5 a gallon for diesel in the last load. And, diesel buses get 6 miles a gallon. So again, as we talk about how do we look in the future, right now we have 2 bus runs in the morning elementary and secondary, same thing afternoon? Are we at the point where we can start thinking about one bus run? Can we get all those kids, instead of running with 20 kids on a bus twice, can we run with 40 kids once? You know, some of those things, which would require some structural changes in what we do. But again, start of that process of how do we manage that a little better?
Question about food services. Did you just say you expected the same demand for school lunches next year that you did this year?
I'm hoping we do. You know, I don't know for sure because this year everything was free.
Yeah,
Right.
that's why I asked. The price is going up drastically from zero.
Well,
So
not for
I was wondering
everybody.
if that would increase, if that
Not for
would decrease
everybody.
demand.
The price will go up for those that aren't on free and reduced. The free and reduced stays about the same. It isn't going to change much for, you know, the
Okay.
majority of people.
The average price is going up.
The price is going up if you don't qualify and you have to pay the full price. The question is, I don't know if the price is going up. The price we pay is going up. I don't know if the price we charge is going to go up. There's a process I need to go through that OSPI has. It's an equity tool that you look at the costs and you look at how much you charge, you know, people, and see if you have to change your price or not. If it does, it won't go up dramatically. It rarely goes up more than 5-10 cents at a time. So there may be a possibility that we will see a slight increase in the amount that people would pay, but it isn't going to be, you know, a huge cost.
All right.
I think Joe was just saying the difference between what they're paying this year, zero, and what they would pay the normal price this coming year is a big change for some people.
It'll be for a
some,
bubble
but
of people
Right,
because
right,
you'll
right.
have a
Right,
flat
right.
point of percentage of people who opt in because it's free and reduced, and that's kind of their option. But then you may have 10% of your school population that will actually purchase, and you know, the remaining portion bring their own food. So it may only hit a very small band. It depends on how many people choose to opt into the food service program.
Yep. I know that my child is going to want to have pizza at least once a week. So
Yeah, and that's my hope, is that we had a higher participation rate this year, and that, you know, I'll use my grandson as an example. It's like, yeah, he wants to have pizza. So he will continue even though he has to pay for it, because, you know, I think he will still participate because he's had that opportunity to try the food and thought this wasn't so bad. And, you know, I really like whatever that was that they served on Thursdays. So I'm hoping that the participation rate stays similar. But the thing is, if it doesn't, we're paying less to the food service management company because it's a per meal price that we pay them. So I think even if the revenue isn't as high as we hope, the expenditure wouldn't either. So I'm hoping it will offset each other. Just realize though, we always spend $250,000 on food service above what our revenue is. It's been traditional since I've been here, and that's what, 18 years. It's like, you know, it's kind of the cost of doing business. So we can also look at activity. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through these because you've seen these, but it's just another way of looking at it. Where the first one was program, you look at, you know, all costs in a particular program, basic ed, ALE, vocational, whatever. This is a way of looking at the activity across all bands. So this is all teaching activity, no matter what program it is. So this is how much we're spending, you know, and again, when we look at teaching, 27 is teachers in a classroom with paraeducators. If we look at, you know, whatever other ones, you know, 44, that's our food service employees, where the food above it is going to be our free or our commodities that we receive from the federal government. So they all have something in there, but it's just a different way of looking at it. But rather than being specifically, you know, think of programs kind of being a spreadsheet going down, this is going across each program.
And just a note for the board and audience members that the maintenance numbers there at 2.5% don't include the capital projects fund, which is where most of the money for major repairs comes from, or the bond, which will be on the ballot in February. So if you're worried about the low number for maintenance there, it comes from other places.
Yes, this is, you know, more of we're mowing the grass and we're replacing the light bulbs and we're, you know, that type of nothing major.
I just know that that's a major concern from some parts of the community. So I wanted to address that when it came up.
Yeah, most of that cost is really just the staffing costs of our maintenance crew, the operational costs of our water treatment facility, those type of costs rather than, the major repairs. And then it breaks down, principal's office. So you think about principals and secretaries and all those things that fall in there. And then kind of the district-wide stuff, which we've talked about before, the different categories of where, and we look at the board of directors, when we look at that, you have to understand what's in each of these line items. Because when you say, well, the board of directors are spending $100,000, well, really you're not. If we have elections with the county, we have to pay the county for those election costs. We pay $30,000 a year to state auditors, comes out of the board budget. There's all those big pieces that come out of the board budget that really isn't the board spending money. It's the district, but because of the accounting manuals, it's where things are allocated. So there's those costs that fall within there. So it isn't like a big change. And when I look at this, I really try to compare things to 1920 more than I do the last 2 years, because the last 2 years have been kind of abnormal in spending patterns. So, how are we doing compared to a couple of years ago? And again, you have to look at, what's in that budget and what is relevant. In 1920, there may have been no board elections. And we may have had a simple audit that only cost us $16,000 that year, as opposed to one that's 36,000 and all those type things.
Yeah, and we had the levy last year, and we'll have the bond this coming year. So that's
Correct.
big
Okay.
expenses there too. Yeah.
Yes, and every time we have those, we pay the cost of whatever the county is, and it's quite expensive, usually in the $50,000 range. And then the last way, and this is how I normally look at expenditures. This is kind of the 40,000-foot view. It's like, how much are we paying for certificated salaries, classified salaries, employee benefits, supplies, services, travel? And, how does that look? And you would anticipate that, salaries and benefits would go up over time as inflation increases each of those things. But it's also affected by how many people do we have? What changes have we made in our staffing and that type of thing? I do want to mention benefits a little bit. Benefits are actually 24% of our total budget. It's a very large percent. It's $5,364,000 out of that $22 million. Medical insurance, you see that as 42.5%. When we moved away from the medical insurance program we had in the state to the School Employees Benefit Board, or SEB as they call it, which is a state mandated insurance, it dramatically increased our cost. And this is why. It used to be that insurance benefits were prorated on 1,440 hours if you were a classified person. So if you worked half of that, 720 hours, you'd get basically a 0.5 allocation. So if it's $1,000, you get $500, right? Well, SEB is set at 630 hours a year for a full 1.0. So now for all those people that were getting $500 of benefit, they're now getting $1,000 of the benefit, which is great for the employee, but it's a big cost for the district to pick up. So you'll see that medical insurance is a huge part of the benefit. And then you look at retirement, it's 33.3%. So depending on which plan you're in, it's 12 to 16% of all salaries. So that's in a big cost. And then FICA and Medicare, like 19%. And then some of the more permissive, the paid family medical leave at 3.6%, though we have negotiated as a district to pay that cost. And then L&I at 1.6 and some of those smaller percentages. But those big three take up a lot of that dollar amount.
And that also extended to substitute employees and not just contracted full-time employees.
You are absolutely right. Substitutes were never eligible for insurance. This year, we have 4 substitutes who have met the 630 hours, and we will be paying the $12,000 a year for medical insurance for them. And they cannot opt out. And even if they do opt out, we still pay it. So it's just one of those things that, kind of the unforeseen hidden costs that the state has laid on school districts. So.
And that the fact that we continue to pay it out. So like, for example, if you have an employee who has insurance through their spouse's work and they choose to not opt into our insurance policy, we still pay the $1,000 into the pool, the collective pool.
Yes. Yeah. It used to be, you didn't have to do that way, but now we do, we pay it no matter what. So it just, I want you to be aware that it's a large cost for us. And we really try to not get into that, 630-hour range if we can with people that, substitutes are a great example, but in the last year, it's been hard to get people. So, we need to fill the classroom. So we have several people that have worked quite a bit. So that's one of those costs. Oops. And then just a summary of that, enrollment, financial. The thing I want to point out here, if you look at 1920, enrollment exceeded expenditures. And that was fairly typical because that's how you stayed in that balance of a balanced budget, right? You maintain your fund balance at a certain dollar amount, and then you always try to make sure your revenue and expenditure balance. If you look at the last 2 years, you see that it has flipped, and now expenditures are exceeding our revenue. And again, flat revenue stream from the state, from the levy, rising costs through inflation. So it's one of those things that, we started to address that this year in the reductions. We probably made about $1.2 million in reductions from what our budget would have been had we just rolled things forward. But even with that, we're still using fund balance. So it's going to be a 3 or 4 year process to get to that point. We are fortunate to have enough fund balance to carry us through potentially, the next 3 years, still using some fund balance and kind of doing this in a step down process rather than trying to do it all at one time.
I would say that we are not fortunate, except in the staff that we have working on these budgets, because I know this has been a planned thing by yourself and Dr. Moshe and everyone else in the district office to build up that fund balance in preparation for this, which I very much appreciate.
Well, it wasn't a surprise. It was very clear when the McCleary decision came down and that regionalization factor came out that they were limiting levy funds and they were actually reducing our funding over the time. There was years where IPD was 1.8% and regionalization dropped 2%. It's actually a negative amount. So it was very clear 6 years ago that we were going to get to this point. It just took a little longer because of the pandemic and the federal funds that flowed in because of that. But it wasn't a surprise.
I'd like to pause just a second, particularly for our student board reps, to see if this is a lot of numbers. This is your first budgeting for both of you. Is there any questions that you have? I want to call you into the conversation if I can. Anything that stands out so far?
I don't have any questions at the moment. Thank you, Dan, for the really thorough report.
Well, I think it's important that you understand the process as opposed to just seeing the numbers, because it is a very structured process that there's a lot of things we don't have control over in this process.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting hearing the process and just seeing all the numbers, like visualizing a lot of things, but I don't have any questions. Thank you.
And I would ask the same question of community members on the Zoom or in person.
Okay, there is a requirement, and it's really more for the legislature than it is for anybody else, but I have to do this formally. The MSOC, the material supplies and other costs that we get funded for, we receive almost $1.5 million. We budget a little more than $1.5 million. So we're going to use a little bit of levy funds to offset that cost. Some years this has been dramatically different, but as part of the budget process, we've been squeezing down the non-employee costs. As the employee costs has increased, all these other costs have been, how do we spend less in those areas? So it's getting closer to be a balance. It's still not fully funded, but it's getting better. We do need to talk about the other 4 funds because you're going to have to vote on those also in the appropriation. First is capital projects. And again, this can only be used for technology and for modernization and repair facilities. I cannot pay a staff salary for this unless it happens to be in those particular areas. We need more help because of technology. We have 1,000 computers sitting there. We need somebody to, do whatever they need to do to get them to the board, that type of thing. So it's very specific where that happens. It comes from the local levy. So it's a property tax, just like we have for the general fund. There's a capital projects tax. It's about, it's $2,250,000 per year, based on that odd collection of fiscal year. Sometimes we get a little more, people pay taxes from a previous year that come in or whatever it might be. So it's about 2.25 million, but roughly it's a little more or less. The non-tax is basically interest earnings. So as we have money sitting in the bank, we expect it to earn a certain amount of money. And then the 715,000 is a federal grant. It's that FEMA grant that we've talked about at the community center. That's about the balance of what is left as far as revenue. And you'll see that on the expenditure side of it, we're going to spend that. It's listed under buildings. So it'll show up in that in the next screen. And then the expenditures have building and technology. So that's where the two areas. The other financing uses is the money that we transfer to the debt service fund to pay for the energy upgrades. And we'll talk about that. We're almost done with that. I expect to have $2 million as a beginning fund balance. That may change because the FEMA grant, we are now starting to draw that down. It's got a $200,000 invoice for the work they've done so far. So that beginning fund balance may or may not change. It isn't going to affect the fact that we still have the money in the bank. It's just when we pay it. It's one of these funds that just continually moves back and forth based upon projects and when projects get done. But I've calculated what we have owing, what we have encumbered, how much money we have, and this is where I expect it will be. And there's a question about an informational question on the F203 about why does the $2 million differ from what the F197, which is the monthly reconciliation with the county is that I'm projecting where we'll be in August. They're projecting where we are right now. So there's always a difference in there in those two things. That's why it's informational and not an error. If it was an error, I'd have to correct it. But if it's just an informational piece, they said, do you realize that it's you have 2.8 million and you're saying you are only going to have 2 million in August, one of those things. So anyways, we plan to spend most of the money, have a little bit of carryover. The reality is it never happens that way. Projects don't always go as quickly as planned. I know there's a question about, we haven't spent a lot of money in the last basically year and a half.
Yeah.
And that really had to do with the pandemic. It had to do with getting people to do work. It's been almost impossible to get people out to do things. JJ has been working, hard on getting quotes, and it's been really difficult at the moment because everybody's in construction seems to be very busy with other jobs. So he has a list of projects. He's working through those, evaluating some of them to maybe modify, what he needs to have done. But, we plan on spending the money. We will have roughly, I think it's 2.4 million next year for building improvements. So that's a carryover of roughly probably $1.2 million in things. It may also be things that we have in place. I know there's $400,000 worth of projects encumbered, but I don't expect they're going to get them done by August and get paid by August. So then they roll into the next fiscal year. So then I need to budget for them because I have to have budget capacity to pay for them because I cannot exceed expenditures without doing a budget revision. So if I budgeted that we got them all done by August and only budgeted 1.2 million for improvements, but we paid 1.6, I'd have to come back to you at some point and say we need to do another budget revision and submit it to OSPI. And it isn't that difficult, except we have to have public hearings. We have to go through the same process we do with the budget adoption. We have to do notification in the newspaper. There's all those costs that are involved in it. So I try to anticipate what I think it's going to be so we don't have to do that. Community center, it's about 1.15 million for that cost. By the way, they're making good progress. Demolition's done. They're starting to tie things together. Fully expect to be done probably by the end of October. So they're getting a lot of work done there. And then the technology, and it's basically the same usage that we have from year to year. Debt service fund. This is the one that's paying for the energy retrofits. Again, it has to go through the debt service fund. And because we have no revenue stream, there is no bond. The money's coming from the capital projects fund. You can see that the actual expenditure of $80,000 is a principal payment on that loan. And the $8,250 is the interest that's on that. So we plan to use that in there. We only have 2 years left in this. So we are currently at the end of, well, above the red line. Our balance is 165,000, start at 780,000. So we have 2 more years, basically 2 more payments, and then there will no longer be this debt. So it'll be one less thing that we will be budgeting for unless we have a bond that will show up in this account. ASB, basically just with this one, we budget a revenue and expenditure that's fairly neutral. Hopefully we're spending a little less so we can try to build fund balance back up. It's a lot more than you can see that we actually did in 2021. And it's probably more than we do in a normal year. So it's just creating the budget capacity. With ASB, it isn't like there's guaranteed revenue. You have to generate the revenue in order to spend the revenue. And it's a conversation I have at the high school all the time, is that just because you have a budget doesn't mean you have money. You have to generate the revenue before you can spend it. So it's one of those type funds that it's just basically it's holding capacity for whatever they want to do in those programs. And it, again, is broken down by very specific areas. The general student body, which is a lot like state apportionment, can be spent basically anywhere in ASB. And then there's athletics, classes, clubs, and private money, which are more the categorical that you can spend in those areas only. So, you can always transfer from the general to the others, but the others, if the classes raise $10,000, it has to stay with classes, right? It can't be moved to someplace else. Yes.
One question I have is, what would fall under private monies?
It used to be things like we would receive what they called invest ed funds. So we'd get a donation from some corporation and it could be used by the counselors to provide some needed item for a student or something like that. So it's normally those type of funds. That has now moved to ASB. It used to be in private purpose trust fund, but it's those type of money. So it's money that has been given for a very specific purpose that can only be used for that particular purpose. We don't see a lot of it. Transportation vehicle fund. Basically, we are anticipating almost $90,000 for reimbursement. That's depreciation. So it's a calculation by OSPI based on the number of buses we have, the year of the bus, the type of the bus, how much time is remaining on their depreciation schedule. And then we expect to spend $239,000. We probably won't spend $239,000 because, a bus is $160,000. We can't buy two, so we'll probably buy one. But it gives the option of, buying a more expensive bus or whatever. And then it just carries over any balance to the following year. We should have about $150,000 at the end of this year. Right now, we have nothing in that account because we bought some buses. But in August, we do get that payment, and the current payment for this year is close to $150,000. So, and it changes over the years. We'll see it as we look at the 4-year projection, based on the number of buses we have and the number we expect to buy, what that anticipated amount looks like. And again, we actually don't buy anything until we actually have the money. So we'll probably order something in August and get it in, late fall or early winter once we know we actually have the money here. But it's important, that we continue to buy buses with this money, because if we fall off the depreciation schedule, we then have no income. And with no income, then we're going to basically drive the buses we have until they are no longer able to be run. When I first got here, we had no buses on depreciation because they had bought a lot of used buses, which was cheaper, but there was no revenue stream. So we had to run a levy for transportation in order to buy some buses in order to get started back with this process again. So very specific on where the money comes from and how the money is used. And it can only be on the typical yellow school bus, doesn't matter the size, but it has to be a school bus. It can't be a van or anything else. And then just a summary, it's all the funds with the revenue, the expenditures, the beginning fund balance, ending fund balance, and where we expect them to be. And you can see that, in general fund, we expect to use fund balance. Capital projects, we expect to use fund balance because we haven't utilized that. And then transportation vehicle fund, we expect to use whatever it is that we get in August for, purchasing buses. At some point, in general fund, we get that beginning fund balance down to that percentage that we want to stay at. We're not going to be able to have this excess revenue expenditure situation. It'll have to be a balanced situation. And there's just a, a multi-year look at the same thing. And, capital projects and all those below it doesn't really matter much because they fluctuate from year to year. But if you look at general fund, you see in 14-15, we're spending 15 million and now we're 22. So it's about a 50% increase over that 8-year period. So quite a change. The majority of that change happened in McCleary. You can see that jump from 17.7 in 17-18 to 18-19. That was the biggest change in, the negotiated salary changes at that time, though were fairly large. I also have to talk about a 4-year budget, which they refer to as the F-195F. And again, take it with a grain of salt. Nobody can project out 4 years to where we're going. Some of the funds are easier. General fund is not. There is a document on our website. It's called the F-195F. There's a link to it. People get to it. It has the information we're going to talk about. First, we look at enrollment. And again, you've seen this. We just kind of project out, if we continue to have these small kindergarten classes, what do we look like 4 years from now? And you can see that it drops to, about 950 from the current 1135 that we are planning. So just, what we expect that change. That's basically just looking at, what happens when we keep bringing in smaller classes and the larger classes continue to graduate out of the system. Again, it doesn't, this is nothing more than just an estimate. So it's just an approximation. So using those students, we can generate the revenue. And again, if you look at that, we get that drop from the federal funding, a little bit of increase for other things, but it's pretty much flat. We're going to stay in about that same range. So I'm not seeing a revenue increase because we're basically talking about, and this is hoping that we stay with regionalization at the same rate, but it's 18%, it doesn't change. And then we see a 2% increase in IPD. Combine those with the drop in the student population, the amount, you'll see a slight increase. But really what you're seeing is like everything else we've seen in the last several years is very flat revenue stream. So then we look at expenditures. And if I increase expenditures by 4%, and thinking IPD is 2%, most salary increases are 2% plus 2%, doesn't include a lot of other things, but just a general idea. You'll see that, we need to get what that total expenditure amount is. And in order to do that, if we add up those columns, we have to make that reduction that's in the bottom of that line. So we're looking at some fairly large reductions. The first one is, there's $1 million of federal funds to start with, and then the changes again. So we're going to have to look at using those type of reductions in the coming years. So that's why we want to start talking about how do we use our resources more wisely? Is there ways we could do things, still provide a wonderful program, but do it in a more cost-effective way? Even with those reductions, though, you'll see we'll continue to use fund balance over the next 4-year period. And so the plan is to reduce expenditures, use fund balance, so that by the time we get to that 4-year period, we are basically almost balanced. There's not a difference between our revenue and our expenditures, and we still have our 6% fund balance, but we're basically at a balanced point. So that's really the plan I'm working at, is how do we do that? And you'll see we start to use less fund balance as we move farther and farther out by making those reductions in there. If we don't make the reductions, then we're not going to get to this point. We're going to run out of fund balance before we get to that 4-year plan. Again, we may have more students. There may be a change. There may be a different funding model. There may be, and that's why I say this is really just kind of the big picture planning. Is if nothing changes, here's what we have to think about. I think we need to, no matter what, we still need to get to a balanced budget. But it's like, what are the variables that are within that conversation? Capital projects fund, it's much easier to calculate. We get, $2.25 million a year. We're going to spend it in buildings and technology, and we're going to end up with a fund balance. There may be some fluctuation from year to year as far as the projects and the timing of those. The one thing that I wanted to mention, if we get out to the end of the year, you'll see that there's 950,000 in there, and there are very specific reason why. talked about levies earlier. They're in a calendar year, January through December. We're in a fiscal year, September to August. Our levy runs through 2025. So there is no 2026 levy at this time. So I can't budget for that spring collection without knowing there's actual levy. So at this point, we're saying that the revenue's lower, the expenditures are lower. Most likely there will be another revenue and we'll see that bounce up.
Thank you. Yeah, I had that question of why the expenditures for building and technology were so low in 25, 26, but that answers it perfectly. Thank you.
Yeah, it has to do with our levy and we don't have a spring collection there. Debt service fund, we have 2 more years, basically 2 more payments, and then that disappears totally. And the plan is that there will be no fund balance at the end in the debt service fund, that we will only transfer as much in the final year as we need, plus any beginning fund balance to make those particular payments. And that fund will be then no longer being used. ASB, just a straight rollover for the next 4 years, assuming it's gonna be very similar, maybe a little less. If we have fewer kids, they might not be generating quite as much revenue expenditure, but very similar. And then transportation vehicle fund, just looking at what our depreciation is, 89,000, 111, 113, 121. That's predicated upon us buying, certain buses at certain times. There's a schedule I can plug things into that calculates what these would do if we bought a, 84 passenger bus in September of 2023, and we bought one in October of 2025 and that type of thing. So it kind of gives you an idea. And it just, looking at spending the money as we have it to buy those buses.
And I assume this does not take into account the hypothetical you proposed earlier, which would be reducing to 1 bus schedule.
Yes, it does take that into account because, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really matter how many runs we have. We need to continue to spend the money that we're getting in order to get more money. So it's one of those situations is if we don't buy new buses, our depreciation eventually continues to drop and drop and drop, and then we're not able to buy any more buses. But basically what happens is the state of Washington will pay us over a 13-year period the cost of a large school bus. And it's a smaller period of time for the small buses. But if we buy a bus for $150,000, over 13 years, they will pay us $150,000. And then we can use that money to buy more school buses. So we are continually replacing buses as opposed to driving a bus for 300,000 miles and then, buying a new bus and have to pay for it from the district. So whether we have 1 run or 2, we still want to continue to buy buses as we can afford them through this depreciation schedule.
The transportation vehicle fund is just for the vehicles itself. It's not for the gas or the maintenance or any of that. So that's why it doesn't change there.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. And basically it just allows us to have newer vehicles rather than, having vehicles that, we honestly have some of those 300,000 vehicles, in the parking lot that they use for emergencies, but it isn't really what we want our kids on. So we try to, stay on this schedule so that every year or 2 we're replacing one of those 10-year-old buses with a new bus. Because even if they don't drive as many miles, even if they only drive 150,000 miles and they're still 16 years old, it's still an old school bus. And that's all I have for you fine folks. Any other questions I can answer?
Are we seeing anything from Zoom? Last call then for Zoom. If you do have a question for the Q&A, please enter your name and location in the Q&A. We'll give it a minute or so. Just your name and location, just so we know that you're typing something. While they're doing that, I will thank you, Dan, again for the comprehensive, detailed, but still comprehensible presentation. I have seen them in other districts. We have it good.
When you were preparing the budget, were there some like tough trade-offs you had to make, or like things like walk us through like potential counterfactuals where a budgetary decision you made, it could have gone a different way?
Well, I'll begin with that I don't independently make budget decisions. It's really more of a team effort. There's a few things I decide, obviously, but it's really talking about program, which is done with the administrative team. And, we spend most of spring talking about, what are the needs? If you look at school improvement plans, where are they going with those? There's something in the school improvement plan that we have to fund that we haven't done before. Are there things that we're doing that we don't need to do or shouldn't be doing? And that's some of the things we look at is I'll bring up, we're spending $50,000 in this area. Is that really a need? Because we certainly, as you look at the budget, we have more expenditure than we have revenue. So are there things in this budget that no longer make sense that, we have done just because we've always done it that way? Do we need to put more money in training as opposed to putting more money into curriculum or whatever it might be? So we talk about all those areas as far as, what is our current need? Like I say, I know a lot of people who do budgets in other districts who just roll things forward and add a percentage. IPD went up 5.5%. We're increasing all costs by 5.5%, but they have the luxury of having either stable or growing enrollment. So it really doesn't matter. For us, we really have to look at what are our student counts, what are our student needs, That's why we look at staffing and it's like, okay, we have fewer second grade teachers this year than we had last year. Well, we have, last year we had 70 kids and now we have 53 kids. So we make those changes. And yeah, I question a lot of costs. It's like, okay, why are we spending this amount of money? And we talk about, what does that need? And sometimes it's like, it's very legitimate. It's like, there's a reason for that. And sometimes it's like, yeah, I don't know why we're doing that. So let's change that. So I really go through, part of my process is I go through every budget item line and there's, thousands of them and look at, what are we spending? Why are we spending it? Some things are obvious that it's, it's utilities. Okay, we're paying so much for electricity at this building. But other things is, why do we spend $4,000 on paper tubes to put blueprints in them or whatever it might be? So I do spend a lot of time analyzing how we spend our funds. And then I try to, bring conversation around the use of our funds and, what really is our purpose each year. Is there, we spent $60,000 on this training last year. Is that really something that we want to do or need to do? Or do we need to spend more or less or whatever it might be? So yeah, there's always trade-offs. I probably couldn't give you a specific off the top of my head of, okay, we didn't spend money. I can give you that we're spending more money in ALE next year than we did this year. Okay. The program was successful and it showed that there was a need for additional funds for, these particular reasons. And I can identify exactly what those reasons were that we spent money on. Spent less money in, let's say maintenance. As I, looked at the actual budget versus the actual cost, and it's like, okay, we spent $30,000 less in maintenance supplies than we had anticipated. We can reduce that amount to, to what is actually appropriate. Copier costs. It's like, okay, we're spending $20,000 on copiers. Why are we doing that? Because now with everything being electronic, we could do something different. There's another way of doing the same thing or whatever it might be.
How about Dr. Moshe's discussion a meeting or two ago of wraparound mental health support for students, particularly at the secondary school? I know that was one of the things that she was really pushing for on this. So that would be one of those choices where if you bring in someone in a position like that, it's a trade-off in other parts of the budget. So that would be an example of how we're using what we've seen through survey data and through experience in the buildings from those who are in the buildings to determine where we need to put an emphasis in the budget.
Another example might be counseling. In the current year, we have a counselor split between the 5th and 6th grade and the 7th and 8th grade. Realized that didn't work. So we are actually providing a counselor in each facility next year. And again, it's temporary. We might change it as we remodify our structure, but we saw a need to have a counselor in a building with kids 5 days a week. And it's additional cost. It's another person basically that we added, but we felt that along the line of that mental health is that we needed that support in that building, that we have kids that have needs that, were not necessarily being met by a part-time person. So there's a lot of those type of decisions as far as, we have limited resources. So how do we spend those resources and what are the needs we're seeing? And some of those needs are identified through the surveys, identified through building staff, through teachers, through students. We need ethnic study classes. Okay, so we actually hired another person for that. It wasn't just that we took somebody we had and moved them into another class. We actually brought somebody in new who we thought could really do justice to that program. So it's an annual process of looking at, what really are the needs that are being identified, and how do we make those choices? And it's really, when we make those choices, it's really around the education. Hopefully, it's around the education of the student. How do we provide the things that we're talking about in our vision and mission of preparing students? What is it that we need to do in order to provide that to them? So.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for the good presentation. I always learn something, or lots of some things actually. So that's fantastic. Speaking of which, I guess my question is more of a recommendation or maybe a query. I know that budgets or finances for the school district come up in lots of formal and informal conversations throughout the community throughout the year. This meeting, is I'm gonna use the word hidden, but that's not the right word. We're in summertime, school's not in, parents can sometimes tap out during this month because they don't have to be super aware of, where their kids are in space in terms of schools. But I'm wondering if there's any way we could highlight this particular meeting, because people in the know how to get to it. But I wonder if there's just using the media we already have and the options we already have for folks, maybe this meeting and some really clear connection information would be good to have on the website or in some way, so that it's like a little reminder, oh yeah, to parents and to the community, because this is something that affects everything else we do in the district. So I'm just wondering if maybe there's a way to, just highlight this resource. This meeting is so powerful for us because we get to see like the little microplanes of what's going on, but it's also, I think, could really help a community member if they had questions. If nothing else, they would be able to see how complex it actually is and how to pinpoint a question based on what their question was, which is often, why is this money getting spent here? So that's just my thought.
The short answer is yes, we can do that. Yes, we can on our website and maybe through the navigator, send out something that says, here's a link on the website, da, da, da.
Yeah, it might be interesting to put something on the school board page, just to highlight this meeting and link to the presentation in the video. But that would be a Mrs. Macaro thing.
Yeah, we just actually got a message from her on the Zoom saying, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Anything else? Okay, it's getting warm in here. Let's adjourn this meeting. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.